Well, hello, everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce Alan Wollenstein, Director of NFL Media, and he's going to be here to talk about this great new 2110-based system that they've actually put to use in the football season last year. So 2021 to 2022, this was up and running, and this will be a very interesting talk. I'm really looking forward to it. Take it away, Alan.
Thank you, Wes. As you said, I'm Alan Wollenstein. I work at the NFL. Specifically at the new NFL Media building in Inglewood. I'm the Director of Systems Engineering Systems. With the 2110, that kind of became a new position. I wanted to start a little bit with the background. The NFL Media had a great opportunity because we got a new building and the standard got ratified at the same time. So we were able to bring them together to build a new facility using 2110. Now, the old facility, just for reference, is in Culver City. The new one is in Inglewood, located next to the SoFi Stadium. Quick information about the new facility. We have approximately, because that is constantly changing, 13,700 by 9,800 signals, and that includes both baseband and 2110. We have 6 studios, 6 control rooms, 5 audio control rooms. I want to mention that one of the other control rooms does have an audio built in, so we are full complement there. We have a BO booth, newsroom set, outdoor demo field area, about 94 edit bays, a mix of both virtual and physical. We are consuming 42 channels of ingest, 42 channels of playback, and we do have 16 systems for slow-mo, but we call that the quick turnarounds, where we do 10 in and 2 out on each one. And I also wanted to mention that because of the new build, we do have fiber throughout the whole facility in SoFi Stadium. So that is actually a big benefit. I do want to mention that we just did, like was just mentioned, the NFL season 2021, all out, including the Super Bowl, from the new facility, and shows that we do, for example, Total Access, Game Day, NFL Now, Red Zone from NFL Network, not to be confused with DirecTV. NFL Media Control Room was used for the halftime Super Bowl show. That's a first in a long time, and it was all done from our facility, as well as we did do our own shows, like have the Super Bowl opening night and honors. In the facility, we also actually do podcasts, like the Around the NFL, NFL Fantasy, and Move the Sticks. That is also using the same technology. And we also have the NFL Digital Department, who are in charge of the video on demand and the streaming, and they use the content that we produce through the facility, specifically the 2110 stuff. I did want to go a little bit into the background of the pre-build because I think this helped a lot for us to do the build. We did have an interop lab in Culver City where we were able to test, learn about 2110, going back to 2 presentations ago today with Kieran, who was talking about understanding and learning. That was a key element that helped us. It also helped us have a control environment, no pressures, no distractions, and this allowed us to create what I like to call a white canvas, but it's really the foundation that everybody in our production was able to see where we were coming from and build our workflows based on that. For the build time, we had a couple of concerns, and this has to do with a little bit of what we learned, right? Is the facility was literally being still built. It is new technology. We were doing new workflows. We did have a deadline, the launch of the season. And on top of it, as we all recall for the last 2 years, and going back to Zoom, little squares, Teams, WebEx, pandemic. Luckily for us, we were able to get a temp facility somewhere in Burbank to do the setup configuration and debugging of the technology. So we could go back and talk to the vendors and say, this is not working, this is working, but we would like it to work that way. That's where we learned a lot of what I would be mentioning. Implemented some of the workflows, not all of them, because we couldn't get everybody in and out, partially because of the pandemic, but we did have that control of who was in and out, as well as fine-tuning some of the tools that we would use to deploy the facility. Once we got past that, we got actually into Inglewood, and that's where a couple concerns that did not arise originally came up, like the scale. In the facility, we tried to build as much as we could, but we couldn't do the whole thing. And as you guys saw, it's a big scale that we had to deal with, right? We had new workflows. Like I said, we did partially develop some of them, but not all of them. We introduced, we weren't able to introduce and train a lot of the operators on what we were learning and progressing with the new technologies. And we were still having some findings that we needed to implement, and we were worried about not meeting the date with that. So that was getting being able to express what we found, and based on what we had found, could they provide us a fix within the time that we needed before the launch? And obviously still the pandemic. Now, some of those got fixed. Mix of the following was the reason for solid launch, right? So we had the interop lab gave us a good learning and testing. So we had a good idea of what we wanted, how to express it. The temp facility gave us the opportunity to do all those fixes that we needed. But one of the biggest steps was taking a step at a time. We didn't do everything at once. We took individual workflow by workflow and concentrated and make sure everything was good. So the first thing we did is do the network and PTP. Right, PTP, as you guys saw, is going to be one of the biggest things. Having a solid PTP is what's going to carry you across if you don't have that. And obviously constant communication. I mean, we were in constant, like almost, if it wasn't every other day, it was at least weekly, talking to vendors, manufacturers, integrators, operators, and the production company, and the production staff. So some of the lessons we learned during that time is, first, for 2110, our goal was to do the opposite. Everybody kept saying, oh, we're going to have 20% 2110, 80% baseband to start with. We were greenfield, so we went the other way. We said, let's do 80-20, because we recognize that you still need baseband. But reality ended up being about 50-50. Why did that end up being the case? Well, first, products that are IP native are not available yet. Like, we're still trying to figure out, especially with the work from home environments, how do we get a Zoom meeting into 2110? That was a big thing. Some products were not fully functioning. We were having issues with them. We had to go back and tell them how the standard works. Others had the standard, but they weren't quite ready for production, so we had to fumble around with them. And actually, we had products that were doing 2110 that were ended during our implementation. So now I'm hunting for more again. Most of the baseband is, that's a good note. Even though we did end up with a lot of baseband, a lot of it is actually just for transmission. That is, we working with other people, like our affiliates or partners and other facilities, because they're still on baseband. So that's another reason, surprisingly, we ended up with a lot of the baseband resources. Another thing that we did learn and we saw, and has been kind of a nice change for us, we are not using as many patches, DAs, or embedders. Actually, a lot of the embedding we're doing is happening in 2110 through the routing. We don't even need embedders. We have one. We have one embedder in the facility as of right now. With NMOS, one of the first things we learned is that it is HTTP based, so there's a native latency to that. So if you're really going to do quick cuts, I don't recommend that, honestly. So we used other protocols, obviously, to do that, and that has worked out well. Now, based on that, it's not a big deal for the senders. If you have senders that are doing NMOS, they register, they push the information, not a big deal. Now, but the other thing that we did learn about the senders that was an issue, and we got a lot of help. I'll talk a little bit about that, and that's why John is there looking and waiting for the words here, are the devices you cannot configure the multicast for them directly. You need to have a tool to provide the multicast addresses to them. So that was a big surprise for us. It was just interpretation by some of the vendors. Okay, devices. Well, there's a lot we learned about using devices. One of the things that unexpected effects based on usage. One of the good examples was quick cuts. On shading, they do a lot of quick cuts back and forth so they can do the coloring. Well, we realized that this device we had chosen could do the quick cuts, but when you were doing a lot of them quickly, it filled up the queue, it slowed down, and then it would take minutes to do them, which is exactly the opposite of what we wanted to do. It did do them, and it did them cleanly, but it slowed down, and it threw the whole thing off. And what can be configured? Another issue we learned, and this is going back to some of those that weren't live or ready for production, is what we could configure or not. Some devices did not have a way to adjust PTP domain, for example. Some didn't even have PTP. They said, oh, if you're receiving, don't worry about PTP. I'm like, that's ridiculous. And we did have issues with that device because the audio and the video for 5 minutes was out of sync. Oh, it needs to warm up. No, it doesn't need to warm up. I need it to be in sync when it gets to you right away. Limit what can be adjusted. Some do not have drivers. So we had some devices that don't have drivers, and we had to force them to work with us. Sadly, for what we needed, like the bridges between audio and 2110 and the audio network. In those cases, for the senders, it's not a big deal because most broadcast control software will allow you to enter an unmanaged version where you can say, this is the multicast, this is the source, this is the format, you're done, move on. But for the receivers, you can't put that. So that kind of creates a tie line. You have to do it statically, manually, where we had to enter the configuration by hand. Another issue that we also encounter is default configurations. If you plug a device and you don't touch and you didn't configure it before enabling within your 2110, that's going to overflow your network, especially when you try to join it and you didn't realize it because a bunch of them are going to have the same multicast, and that's just going to join 30 different devices that should have been one. So you got to watch out for those things. Database, big important element here. Track how many databases you're going to be using. We made a lot of our decisions based on trying to minimize that, and we ended up with two, the broadcast controller and the tally one. I had count, so that was another conversation because we had, at one point we were looking at 5 different databases just for the drivers. We were able to minimize it and get it to work with 2, so we were good there, but then that brought, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit and talk about the communication for the sync between the 2 databases. They have to have a common protocol, and I want to thank the 2 companies that we work with for working together and making that happen, especially because there's new entries and levels to be considered with 2110 that the software, especially in the tally, had to consider and bring into their cycle. Plus, you also have to consider going now to the whole database update that you have to add that sync step, right? You normally do a push and you're done and move forward, but now that you're doing 2 databases, 3 or 4, how are you keeping them in sync? What are the steps? How long do they take? Which takes me to the middle point. When you have a high count in your facility, you have to watch out for that because it can be a long time for doing the publishes, for the updates. And that can be disruptive to your workflows. And another difference is some of the devices like your control panels, which need to update, will do a long initial time. It'll take minutes to boot up. So that you have to really be conscious of when and how you're doing those pushes and reboots. As we've been saying, we can run both HD, UHD, SDR, and HDR in our facility. And some of the things that we learned about or we had to watch out was what does the device support and how they support it. The first thing that became bluntly obvious is, can it support one format at a time, both formats, or both formats simultaneously? If you're doing one at a time, how is the switch done? Do you have to reboot the box? Does it take the NMOS trigger, or can it just be a checkbox and it moves over to the other one? That was a big question because we need to figure out, okay, are we going to go to that workflow? We need to account for the time to do the switchover. As well as reserve them for devices that can't generate format. How do we deal with the ones that can't do either? Right? So the devices that can only do, for example, HD, but need to work with one that does UHD, does it have a format converter that we can use on the fly to upres, for example, from HD to UHD? So is that a specific port or not? And therefore we have to assign that and tell the operator ports 1, 9, X and Y are always going to be your format conversion, or otherwise you won't be able to do UHD with some HD sources. Also, what else changes? That was a big learning curve right here for devices with the NMOS. They end up using the GUIDs, right? That's how we identify each individual receiver and sender. We discovered that for a specific device, it used the same NMOS for the first two signals for 4K than it was using for two of the UHD, for the ones for 3G, and then it added two new ones that it didn't have before. And that kind of affected how the database entry worked, right? Because now, do we put them both with the same GUID? Do we put them as one entry with the same GUID? How do we deal with that? We ended up separating it then, and the database gave us a warning, you have two with the same GUID. Luckily, we could move forward and it wasn't an issue, but something that we learned about that did affect us is that if you do have a transmitter that does both HD and UHD simultaneously, and you put a receiver with saying that it can receive both, but it's one of those that does it one at a time, and it's in HD mode, and you route it, the database could route the UHD version and overflow the buffer and overwhelm the system. So you got to watch out for that kind of stuff on devices. Some of the tools that we use that really helped us out figure a lot of that. Query and manage ISO 4 and 5 software, right? So we have the multicast, going back to being able to assign those multicast addresses for the ones that don't allow you to do it, and confirm the correct data. We notice that sometimes when you do the route, you have to go in and make sure they got the right data, and then you can troubleshoot back from there to see where the mistake was introduced. And we're honest, one of the tools here is Multicast Wrangler. Thank you, John. It helped a lot. And I think Riddle's here too, the Riddle Explorer. Signal path mapping software. Luckily for us, the broadcast controller we selected had the signal mapping software built in, which allowed us to look at the workflows and see what was the source, if you were, or embedder, right? How did we embed it if we didn't embed it, and follow those paths. It also allowed us to look at the device status, so we could monitor and see if the devices are online, if they're offline. And that's been a big element on the season, always going back and seeing if the device is online or not. And obviously deployment software, how to set up the switches, how to set up the devices. One of the things that we worried originally, like I mentioned at the top of the conversation, was how much time did we have to deploy it? And we needed to set up about 60 switches. And being able to use Ansible, for example, helped us deploy those really quickly. Within 40 minutes, they were up and running within the network. Elements that really helped us, I cannot emphasize enough, PTP. A good PTP leader that understands the 3259-2 profile is huge. Switches that can actually support that is a huge element. We had a switch that couldn't support that, kept dropping in, and that was creating havoc all over the network during the testing. Big element. And I think if Lee Combe is here, he would agree with me. Do that infrastructure, be explicit, explain it as carefully, prioritize correctly, or the PTP is going to blow up on your face, because that's the excuse everybody uses, the network and PTP. Having a solid PTP-based network allowed to concentrate on the real issues. Big element there. IP gateways, a good selection of IP gateways. We chose between two versions, let's call it. The high density, which allowed us to do multiple functions in multiple channels, and a smaller one that we call the throwdowns, where we can put them usually in monitoring positions so we could see the 2110, because a lot of the monitors are still not 2110 natively.
Great, thank you, Alan. Okay, do we have any questions for Alan?
Hey, Alan. Hey, first, congratulations on this excellent build in using 2110. We're hearing a lot about new builds looking at 2110-22 with JPEG XS. Is that something that you've been looking at all or considering for future projects as opposed to uncompressed?
Actually, we had considered it earlier on, about a year ago, to do it more for for what would be replacing the baseband as we interact with other facilities. And that kind of has re-emerged recently, and we are looking at it as one of the choices. Right now, that workflow is pretty solid as we used to do it, even in Culver City, but the goal would be to transition into it maybe in the longer term, because the other consideration we were doing was 2022-6 just in general as an alternative to that. But Andy and I have a debate about that.
How long it took from start to finish? When you started having the meetings and looking at the design considerations?
So from the start of the first meeting to the design considerations, or until we finished building? Until we finished building, that took about 4 years. 2 of them were actually the build during the pandemic.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Alan. This has been great. Appreciate it.